Yes, I did.
Okay, well, here's the moment where I try to pronounce your name and ask for you to correct me if necessary, okay?
Cool, cool. Just pronounce it in English, man. It's not. I'm not. It's not that important. It's not that important to
No,
me.
I mean, I through the podcast and through the coaching and counseling work I do, I talk with people all over the world,
Okay.
and I really like to try to learn how to pronounce people's names with with their native inflection.
Okay.
So let me try this one out. Rune Hjarnø Rasmussen.
No. That sounded a little bit Icelandic, but that's cool. Cool. Go with Icelandic. In Danish, it would be Rune. So the R is pronounced like in German. The Danish R is like in German or French, so it's like Rote Reichskanzler.
Rune.
Uh, Rune, yeah, and
Rune.
the H is unpronounced, so it's Hjarnø. Uh,
Hjarnø.
yeah, yeah, that's good. That was good.
In Rasmussen.
Rasmussen, yes, yeah, that's good.
Rasmussen.
That's good. Yeah,
Okay.
impressive.
Hey, thanks. Well, I'm a musician, so I have pretty good ears, and
Yeah,
I like to
uh,
do impressions, so it helps.
Danish is pretty messed up when it comes to pronunciation. It's just the Danish language just went down weird roads when it comes to sounds. So yeah.
Huh. Well, maybe we can talk about that because I'm sure it has something to do with the mix of who, like the kind of ethnic makeup of Denmark, right?
I'm not sure. I actually I doubt it's going to be particularly relevant to an animism discussion because I don't think that there are animism related reasons for it. It's more something with proximity to other European languages that, for instance, have that R sound rather than the Spanish sounding rolling R that you find in other parts of Scandinavia.
Hmm.
So yeah, I don't know. But if you want to, we can talk about it. But
No, that's cool. So for people who don't know, you have a platform called Nordic Animism. And yeah, let me just explain how I found you. Um, so I interviewed Bayo Komalafe a little while ago, and I was just doing my research, looking for different interviews that he'd done, and I found your interview with him. And I think it was the first interview where his views really started to click with me. Like I started to understand where he was coming from. And so I really appreciated the way that you guided that interview. It really helped me to understand his ideas a little better.
oh, I'm really happy to hear that. It was a wonderful a wonderful interview, by the way. I have a really good vibe with Bio, so yeah.
Yeah, and I subsequently did an interview with him and had the same kind of experience. I just really enjoyed talking with him and playing with ideas. He's got a lot of the trickster energy that I appreciate,
Yeah,
as do you, I think, which maybe accounts for the affinity that we might all have with each other.
totally.
And so you were going to
Yeah.
say something when I mentioned the Nordic Animism platform.
Was I going to say something about it? It's there. It's called the Nordic Animism Platform, and you can find it on social media and stuff like that. I forgot what I was about to say. So
Okay. Yeah, you've got a YouTube channel where you've got a lot of videos about Nordic animism and other things like related things as well. And I really like your how your personality comes across. You're not a typical scholar. You have a sense of humor and playfulness that I appreciate.
not a typical scholar. You have a sense of humor. Yeah, I like I like how you put it. But yeah, yeah,
Well, a lot of this stuff can get very dry, and animism to me is anything but dry.
totally, totally. Actually, Graham Harvey, this great British scholar who has been talking about this or been talking about animism, he wrote this animist manifesto, and it's actually it's humoristic. It ends up with a statement that animism is not particularly well suited to be communicated in manifestos, and you should, sing soulful songs and tell trickster tales instead. That's kind of part of the manifesto. So I think, that at least trying to find a humorous note is actually very seriously important in order to make sense from an animist perspective.
Hmm. That reminds me of a paper I came across fairly recently from an anthropologist, and the title of it was something like, "Do we take animism too seriously?" And he had done some field work with, I think they were Sami shaman, and or Mongolian shaman, but he was talking about how they kind of played tricks on the gods, or they would curse the gods when things didn't go well, and they would make jokes about and to the gods that they're worshiping, and doing rituals for, which was so great.
I think I know the paper. It might have been Rane Willerslev, who's actually from Copenhagen too, studying
Ah,
the Chukchi or the Yucca gear. I'm not sure which one in Siberia.
oh,
And
okay. Hmm.
it was about a bear hunt, wasn't it?
Yes.
Where the spirit of the bear is dangerous somehow, but then the whole relating to it turns humoristic at some point. But that's pretty much what I remember from that part.
Yeah, that's great. And for people listening, if you're interested, I'll put a link to that paper in the description. It's really good and offers a different perspective, I think, than we normally get through anthropological reports. Again, lack of humor, and I think the animistic cultures have a lot of humor. It's a big part of it. Before we get into the specifics of that, when we talk about Nordic animism, what areas does that encompass? What geographic areas?
Well, like the term Nordic is one that I have been actually a little bit insecure about choosing a term, because when you are choosing, say, you're choosing a data field, for instance, as a scholar, then you could always have chosen it in different ways, and there would have been other advantages in doing it in other ways. It could have been limited in other ways. Like, I think about the Nordic area as a kind of a fluffy area, kind of centered around Scandinavia and Northern Europe. But I would actually have liked to include parts, perhaps all of the British Isles in that, because I think it is um, a similar kind of landscape and similar kind of animism, therefore, because it's relating to the same landscapes. When you look at, say, English folklore, you find a very rich animist tradition that in many ways looks very Nordic, or perhaps Nordic looks very English. And so, so I, and we can't really hear that in the word Nordic, that I would kind of like it to have
Mm.
included also the West side, because it sounds very much like Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Finland and Iceland, right? Um, so so yeah, there's a bit of a backdrop to choosing such a term, but um, but it also has the advantage, the word Nordic, that people tend to know what it means. If you say Nordic, then yeah, you kind of know that you're in northwestern Europe somehow, and it's like part of the point of animism is also to create it is to create connectivity, right? Which is part of the reason that you need to choose words and language that people understand. And sometimes you have to choose words and language that people understand over words and language that might have a slightly higher degree of precision, which would be the typical scholarly choice. And like paradoxically, the a lot of the anthropology that looks at relational worldviews, and this, for instance, what is called the ontological turn or the Cambridge school, like it's all about relation and being in relation, but it is probably like the most unrelational language that I have ever encountered. It's very, very difficult to understand what's being said,
Mm.
which means that, you know, it doesn't reach out in the world, and perhaps it's also not the objective of that language to create relation, but yeah. So different things could be said for and against the Nordic delimitation.
Mhm.
But I think it works reasonably well.
Mhm.
I'm also a little bit. It also has a bit of an, you could say, a question mark around it in relation to diaspora Euro-descendant people, for instance, in North America or other parts of the world, uh, because how do they identify with that? And I think when you talk about traditional knowledge, it's really important that it doesn't become seclusive. And far the greater majority of humans today, and particularly of the people that are racialized as white, are in diaspora. Most of us don't live in the same area as our great grandparents, and it's important that these concepts are available also for these people to understand themselves and to engage perhaps the landscapes that they're living in.
Mm. Yeah, and to help reclaim some of their ancestry. Like, I mean, I'm a third generation Canadian, and the area that you describe as encompassing your kind of field of study is like the map of my 23andMe DNA map. I mean, it's all Northwestern European, Scandinavia, but over in Britain and Ireland as well. So it's really hard for me to choose an identity in terms of ancestry, you know. And Nordic animism is a little catchier than Northern European animism, you know, which
Yeah,
is maybe a
yeah,
bit broader. Uh, there's also that thing too about animism, maybe not being compatible with geographic boundaries, right? Like the oak tree doesn't care about those boundaries, right? And so the oak trees on the British Isles would be as revered as the oak trees in, let's say, Scandinavia or Germany, right?
possibly. Like sometimes, yes.
Mm.
You certainly find that animisms do not follow, for instance, nation state lines. I mean, totally, certainly not. You're going to find the same. You're going to find traditions diffusing over nation lines. They're also going to be shared across fairly deep cultural lines. So if you have Swedish agrarian people and Sami pastoralists living in the same forest area, you're going to find that they will be sharing animist ideas about relating to that landscape. Um, so, so, I think one of the main points of animism is that it is, in a sense, or that the landscape part of what it is very important. There might be a cultural heritage that, some people are giving to their children and so on. Of course, there is. But I sometimes think that aspect of a cultural heritage is overemphasized. For instance, some like to think about an Indo-European heritage, which then becomes and like the advantage of thinking like that is that then you are you're expanding the material that you can think with. If you have suddenly included the entire of the Indo-European language groups, then you have Hittite and Luvian and Farsi, Zarathustrian, Hindu, Sanskrit, Vedic. You have a huge package of material that you can work with and work from, which is, I guess, useful. But it has the disadvantage, I think, that it hones in on a tradition as something that is inside our culture, inside our heritage, more than something that emerges in our meeting with the specific landscapes. So I think it's important to have this outwards concrete view of what animism is.
So more specific to place.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. How did you, well, actually, the other thing before we move away from that, why animism and not paganism?
Because paganism, like in the Nordic context, paganism is most often called heathendom or heathenry or heathenism, and it is a very specific cultural complex that you can study it historically. When you study it historically, you are faced with some very difficult source material. You need very sharp and kind of awake source criticism when you are engaging this material, and you are speaking about an enclosed context that is very far away. I always felt that there was some sort of a it's almost as if there was a bit of a backdrop to the, in a European context, comparatively high quality of that material, because it means that there is a distancing in looking at that distant context and trying to attain, like it becomes very much an academic endeavor. If you look at many, for instance, heathen debates online, and how many Nordic heathens talk about their religion, it becomes this, yes, very academic endeavor, sometimes practiced by people who aren't scholars themselves. So it's even kind of badly practiced academia sometimes, but it becomes basically scholasticism, where people are talking about the theoretic validity of X proposition about what people in this very distant context might have been thinking about this or that religious reality. So it moves very far away from us. When you think animism, you open the entire cultural history for dialogue, and you can say, well, animism is not only something that existed in a pre-Christian context. There were elements of cultural resilience in which aspects of the pre-Christian spirituality was transformed into new forms in Christianity. There were perhaps aspects of Christianity that became almost animist itself. There was parts of what is sometimes called folklore or folk belief that continued existing through centuries, and which are in many ways like completely detached from Christianity, but fully valid as animism. Now, if you have a Scandinavian cult of a home patron spirit, there are these sort of gnome elf-like figures that have protected people's homes. If you have that sort of a say spiritual engagement, um, that cannot be labeled pre-Christian because it was only documented in the 18th and 19th century. So it cannot really be projected back in 800 years into the Iron Age, because things are in transformation, and particularly animist worldviews are dynamic. They are always in relation, and since the world changes, then they are adaptable and change with the times. So that means that back projecting folklore on, for instance, pre-Christian paganism or heathendom is methodologically problematic. So this just means that saying animism is a way of opening the ball again, basically, with a new field to play on, and say, hey, that engagement with a fire spirit from 19th century Norway, that is a fully legitimate expression of animism. Forget about whether it was there 800 years earlier or not. It may have been, it probably was, but strictly speaking, how can we tell? It's animism, you know,
Mhm.
and that so in that way, I've found animism to be it's I think it's a stronger way of engaging a larger part of history than thinking, for instance, paganism or heathendom.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah. Um, and I guess too, like paganism and heathenism were terms that were only used in like the Christian era to speak about the non-Christians, basically, right? Um, and
Mainly,
animism,
yes.
so yeah, animism, I guess, seems like it's a broader designation. Now,
Yeah, animism has its own problematic
well,
history, but yeah, let's
right,
not
it's
go
still a
there.
term for like those others that are being studied from an
Yeah,
anthropological context, right?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's the thing that is always a kind of struggle. Like, how do you name your worldview without using these terms? Because
Mm,
an animist would never, like a traditional animist, would never call themselves an animist. It would be just that's the way things are. It's not a belief
yeah,
system, it's a matter of fact that fire has a spirit and we can communicate with that spirit and engage with it. So it's always a bit of a
totally.
problem for us moderns, right?
Yeah, totally. And often those traditional knowledge systems might just be called that tradition, and that's it, or custom, and that's it. You
Mhm.
know, typically focusing a little bit like the word custom, focusing on that it's something that we just do.
Mhm.
And in many cases, anthropologists who have been interviewing animists in different places in the world would have been told and asked, so why do you do this or that? They would just say, well, because that's what we've always done.
Mhm.
And I think part of the reason behind this way of formulating animism is to actually focus away from the talking about and focus on the actual engagement, the doing, um, as which can, like in and these can sometimes clinch. Like I have become familiar with the Afro-diasporic religions, particularly in Brazil, um, and and in those religions they're very clear about not talking too much. Like talking too much is something you shouldn't do. Asking about stuff, why do you do this or that? It's not a good idea. The best thing is just to do it and learn the practice and the sort of the nitty gritty, what do you call it in English, nuts and bolts of how to make that this kind of spirituality role, rather than to think a lot about it or talk a lot about it.
Mhm. Yeah, very similar to the yogic tradition too, where, I'd ask my teacher, well, why do we do this in a particular way? Well, that's what my teacher taught me,
Yeah,
and that's what I'm passing on to you. And then it's up to you to, okay, accept it, give it a try, and have the experience yourself
yeah,
rather than discuss for days about the why.
exactly,
The why becomes
exactly.
apparent in the doing of it.
Yeah. Or
Mhm.
it can be that why can be polyvalent. It can hold contradictions in it, and it holds those contradictions better if you don't articulate it too much.
Hmm. Well, contradictions, but also just maybe
Or
multiple
paradoxes. Yes.
multiples that maybe
Yeah.
maybe don't even contradict with each other but
Yeah.
coexist
Yeah.
in a kind of more complex entanglement.
Yeah.
um yeah, I wanted to ask you about your encounter with the Afro-Brazilian traditions, and so maybe it's part of this question, but I wanted to know like how you got into the study of animism.
Um. Yeah. That I think I started focusing on sort of the academic animist thinking actually when I was doing my PhD on Afro-Brazilian tradition, and I was looking for ways of engaging that stuff that were as what is it, as horizontal as possible, as like respectful of that reality as absolutely possible. And these animist thinkers was basically the best I found, where I felt that with that academic position, that enabled me to come to these priestesses, and my actual academic investigation became me learning from them. I was actually learning their reality, and that was what I was learning from, rather than me mapping their reality and then walking out of it and saying something about it that they would have just thought, what the fuck is he talking about? Which is, often the case that scholarship works like that. Um, and so I found that's how I got on the path of these particular ways of thinking in the scholarship.
Yeah, but
Uh,
what led you to, I mean, a guy from Denmark how do you get interested in these Afro-Brazilian cults?
yeah,
What's that
that's
introduction?
yeah. It's perhaps it's almost like a bit accidental through your studies. I started studying Nordic religion, but got a little bit disillusioned because of that whole source criticism, data problematic situation that I described to you before. So I was a bit like, man, I'm not going to spend my study years studying, faulty, but over biased reflections of by Christian writers of a worldview that disappeared 200 years before they started writing it down. If I want to understand spiritual knowledge, then I need to go and talk to people who are actually practicing it now. So, and that was my motivation to think, okay, so, and initially I just had the impression that these particular kinds of religion were very vibrant in our time today, fairly accessible. You don't have to learn extremely difficult languages to talk to these people. Spanish will do. You can actually, just go down there and start. After a couple of months, you'll get along. And they look actually these kind of religions look very similar to European uh, European polytheisms or animisms. So there was sort of that kind of considerations that were there. Then there's also the perhaps random fact that there's been at least one important anthropologist in Denmark who has actually gone and studied condomblé, as the Afro-Brazilian thing is called. And I read her book, and at the time, I think I was focusing on reading the Jewish tradition. And I remember waking up, literally sleeping with my head on the divorce legislation of the Talmud, like this. I just wasn't cut out for that. So I thought, fuck it, I'm gonna.
I need a party.
Yeah, that more or less, I was in my early mid 20s. I'm like, okay, I'm going to start training capoeira. I'm going to go to Brazil. I'm going to start studying voodoo. So that's what I did. I started training capoeira, and did capoeira quite intensively for quite some years. And that was also part of me going to Brazil, because if you do capoeira, Brazilian dance fighting, then you already know people there. So you don't just land with your backpack and say, okay, so where is the Inca Trail? You land in a group with their
Mm-hmm.
people that already live there, and so on. So that was how I kind of got into that. And I then think that part of what I got out of it, or what I learned from it, was ways of thinking about how to basically make what you could almost call animist safe spaces in modernity. Uh, I think that what these people do, and the reason that as I said to Bio, that his people, the Yoruba, will be remembered on the same level as the Greeks and the Romans and Mesopotamians, is that they built a culture of resilience to modernity that is extremely effective. You walk into these houses, these where they practice this religion, and they have a very powerful presence of like possession, for instance, can happens with such an immediacy and such a power in those spaces, and that is, well, that's a result of many different things in the way that they build their practice, but it is partly a result of how they build that whole space, almost as a kind of a ontological bubble in modernity, where reality itself just operate by different rules, and those distinction between us as humans and other than humans are much more permissible than they are in most contexts in a Western urban society.
That's for sure. Yeah. I think that's so fascinating. So when you started engaging in capoeira, you were already thinking like this is a preparation to do the field work in Brazil. Is that right? Or
No, it was more like I was interested in capoeira, and I also thought that the religious space was interesting. So I did my bachelor's degree about condomblé, writing about condomblé, and that was a little thing. And at that point, I had lived, I think, 6 months in Brazil. Um, the Danish education system at the time was rather open. You could just say, okay, you didn't even have to tell them. You could just leave and then come back, a couple of years later and say, I'd like to take some exams, and then do that.
oh wow.
And for me, that meant that during my MA education, I took quite a long time to do it. But during that time, at one point, I just left university without telling anybody. I was gone for 2 years, worked in Sudan, Angola, and I went to Brazil. I went 2 times to Uganda and 2 times to Brazil as part of my education, because it was kind of loose at that time, the Danish system. So and that, for me personally, that was very useful, because I could use that to just go get out whenever it started it started being too much Talmud divorce legislation going on.
Oh, that's really fascinating. My introduction to the Afro-Brazilian religions was through a cult called the Santo Daime. It has a
Yes.
a large element of Umbanda kind of embedded in it. It depends on what lineage you're in, but the one that I was practicing in had that quite strongly. And I went to a ceremony on February 2nd, which is the day of one of the days of Iemanjá.
Yeah.
And I had this like incredible experience. And I love that space that you're talking about, the terreio, where you enter into an alternate reality where the divisions between human and not merely human are way more porous and open. And being on the west coast of Canada, the only place I could find that was had a bit of that was in the capoeira Roda.
Mm.
And I saw, I'd go to a capoeira class, and they wouldn't really talk about the spirituality too much. They would talk about Ashe just being kind of a life force that we're generating through this practice. But I saw in the white clothes, in the circular form, in the music, I saw all these resonances with Umbanda. And it was never talked about explicitly because it was mostly people of European descent teaching these classes. And And I guess for them, the spirituality wasn't a big part of it. But for me, it was the closest I could get to that kind of space. So I kind of
Yeah.
went in a little bit backwards from your entry into it.
Yeah. Oh, that's super cool. Yeah, I was kind of a capoeira born again for about 10 years. I was totally into it. I was totally into it. And I actually did my MA about traditional knowledge forms in capoeira, because I think that some there are some really deep things going on actually in capoeira, and it's very difficult to see them. There's a lot of or at least I haven't been in capoeira for some time now, but my how I remember capoeira was that there was a lot of talk and a lot of but about it, or kind of away from it almost. But the actual culture of what they call the Mandinga is almost it almost seems forgotten. Like you need to go to Salvador and you need to speak some of the real old timers,
Mm.
and then you can kind of you can get bits and pieces of it, but and I was like, I wanted to sort of try to basically describe a little bit of this to just make it available to contemporary people, basically, or contemporary practitioners.
Mm. I think it speaks to like how uh, those, the echoes of the Yoruban tradition can be found in different styles of capoeira. Uh, it speaks to the resiliency that you were talking about of this particular, I don't know if we call it a religion, has so many kind of variants. But part of that is its adaptability is what makes it resilient, right? So, I mean, what is it about this particular tradition that allows for so much adaptability and
Mm.
still retain the ashe, the kind of original vivifying spirit of it? Have
Mm.
you been able to get a sense of that? Like, what makes it possible for
Yeah.
this? Yeah.
Um, I might not have a very strong answer, but my suggestion is that, and I'm following an American scholar on this suggestion, that if you look at Yoruba land in West Africa, then what you really have is a lot of intersecting city states almost, where there's little royal houses that dominate a specific area, and they're kind of sometimes they're a bit in conflict with each other, and there's been a lot of war going back through history and so on. And what you sometimes find is competing mythologies. So inside, like, Yoruba traditional religion is not like one package and it's just like that. And there are different mythologies, and they flow into each other, and different deities will sometimes adopt aspects of each other. So if there is a story that tells that Obatala, the creator deity, kind of wired himself down of a golden chain and created the world. Then and they're telling that story perhaps in Ile Ife in Yoruba land. Then perhaps if you go to Oyo, then perhaps they're telling the same story about Shango, their main deity. I'm not sure if they do exactly that, but this principle sometimes works like that. So this means that sometimes in Yoruba land, you have, for instance, a compound of people who are living in a space, an ile, where there's a group of people living, and in that, extended family, they might have their own mythology. They might be telling you that, well, it's actually Ogun, the god of iron, who is really the creator god, and so on and so forth. But perhaps they're living in Oyo, where the king is saying that it's Shango who is the creator god. So there are actually alternative mythologies that are coexisting in the same space. And this is also connected to power. And that whole web of interrelation and power and struggle and sometimes contradiction that needs to be resolved, where people perhaps inside a compound will say, well, it's actually our mythology that's the best one, and so on. That has perhaps contributed to the capacity of Yoruba descendants in the Americas to be able to intersect with very oppressive power, knowledge power that they encountered there. And so that's one aspect. Another aspect is their trickster thinking that I spoke with Bayo about, that they have this very beautiful and powerful trickster mythology, which where the trickster is a very, very important foundational function in everything, and nothing would move, nothing would be mobile or transformational or dynamic if it didn't have the trickster, if reality didn't have a trickster. And that enables them to also to twist meanings. So you see that the identifications between their gods and the saints, they sometimes twist the meanings quite a lot. So if Shango is mostly identified as a young, virile, powerful man who is filled with fire and intensity, then perhaps he will be identified with Saint Jerome, I think would be in English, who is an old man that's sitting and reading a book. There's almost an inversion there, right? Or a sharp change. Saint Sebastian, who is a naked, effeminate man pierced by arrows, that was his martyrdom, would perhaps be identified with Oshosi, the hunter who's shooting a bow. Again, so there are these trickster things going on in their way of relating to the power languages that they encounter. And you also see that on other levels. You see it in how they relate to modern language. You see how they cope with and deal with and create resilience towards racism, and so they have this, like, these particular people just had this amazing capacity in their culture to create thinking that is simultaneously very traditional. It is as if it stays so true to its traditional form, or to its traditional context, while it's very, very transformational and it has an incredible capacity to include. Like if you look at stuff like condomblé, it has significant, or the whole condomblé, for instance, Umbanda that you mentioned, as significant components from Europe. European Spiritism played a major role in these particular religions, and that was basically because that was well aligned with them. So
Yeah.
why not use it?
Yeah. Alan
If the
Kardec
shit,
comes from Europe, and they're doing mediumship. They go, oh, we've got
yeah,
mediumship too. Great.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, and it's also, I think, the whole spiritism, like that idea of dead people, and I just think that just went click between West Africans and Central Africans and Europeans. They're just very aligned, these different kinds of people. So that just went brrr. So if you go to France, where Allan Kardec, supposedly came from, you're not going to find any Kardecianism there. You're not going to find any spiritism, or very little. But in Cuba, Brazil, Haiti, even Nigeria, it's world religion. So there's this very strong thing that happened there. So it attests how connective these kinds of being religious are.
I think that's a really fascinating point to contemplate, that having a trickster deity like Eshu central to your pantheon allows for all of the contradictions and conflicts. They're an expression of that deity, of that force. And so it's able to be accepted. I mean, it's it's fascinating. So like Nordic animism would have a trickster deity as well, right? Whether that's I guess Loki or maybe Raven, right? So why wouldn't it have the same resiliency and ability to syncretize with the Christianity that came in? And you know what I mean?
There might be many explanations for that. There might be many explanations for that.
Maybe it was being so close to the military force of the Catholic Church, and so like the forced conversion was maybe more possible in Northern Europe than it would have been in the African diaspora.
Well, I think one factor is time. Um, if you think about the time that Yoruba were enslaved and abducted to the Americas, then that is perhaps 150 years ago, 170, something like that, perhaps at the latest. Uh, Less than 200 at least. If we think of the time that Scandinavia were Christianized, uh, perhaps roughly around the year 1000, and then we think 200 years down the line from that, then we have the 1200s. Is that the time of Richard the Lionheart or something like that? It's a very, 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 very long time ago.
Mhm.
You know, so so Christianity has been here and been linked with power for much, much, much longer. Um, there might also be something about the ways that Christianity was implemented. I'm not sure. I think that there that the whole racism structure sort of created, it also created a little bit of a separation where I think white people in some cases probably didn't care that much what these people were doing in the slave barracks. So racism has played some sort of a role as well, where if you were white English in 15th, 16th century, and you were practicing something pagan, that would receive an incredible amount of social attention, and it would not be sanctioned. It would be, there would be cultural consequences implemented on that.
Hmm.
So, and like if you could compare to Scandinavia, you see that the Sami, there has been a bit of that sort of racialized marginalization of the Sami, and they continue to have almost heathen practices much, much, much further down in time, because there was that sort of denigration of them as inferior peoples of some sort. So,
Hmm.
so, so
Mhm.
there might be different factors in this, but I actually think that when you look at Scandinavian early history, you see some similar patterns of resilience emerging. You see saints emerging that look remarkably like Nordic deities. You see patterns of Christian behavior that look remarkably like heathen practices emerging. And like in some cases, uh, Christian, the implementation of Christianity basically went, well, let's continue practicing this or that. Let's just call it something Christian. So there has been a attention, there has been a struggle, and some heathen practices continued surprisingly, or has had a surprising resilience. So you see, a man in Norway in a farm would go out and slaughter a cow on a burial mound outside the farm when his father dies, some kind of a sacrifice. At the turning of the 20th century, close to between the 19th and the 20th century, it is a remarkably heathen thing to do, but it's kind of just continued to be there sometimes, so yeah, I think there are different factors that define that.
Yeah, I was thinking about it too. It's like one of the aspects of the trickster is to kind of hide in plain sight, to trick. And when we look at something like capoeira, it's kind of a ritual hidden in plain sight. You could be on the streets performing this ritual, and it would look like martial arts or a dance. That seems to be an important aspect of it too. But I think, yeah, it makes sense to me what you're saying about the racism, that separation. Like, as long as they seem to be paying lip service to our Christian God or our saints, well, okay, good enough. They're other, and so we can't expect them to be fully Christian. So, yeah, hadn't thought about that angle, but talking about this timeline of the Christianization of Scandinavia, I think one of the things that if we haven't really studied it, there's a sense that it was like a moment in time. It was like before 800 pagan, after 800 Christian. But this was a process that took quite some time, right? Do you have any sense of like how long it took for the animist practices that were native to that place to be kind of usurped by Christian practices?
That's a difficult question because some practices are still there.
Right, like you were saying, it still it was never complete.
Yeah. And if you go back like just a little bit in time, so much more. And a lot of the animist practices in the folklore were considered in the time itself very, very heathen. Like if you went back, say, 150 years, and people would be giving beer and porridge to elves in a mound, you can be sure that the local pastor he wouldn't have had a problem naming that a heathen thing. He would definitely there would have been strong condemnation. So and in some cases, the cultural resilience that I spoke about before has also, continuously been there. I read about May Day rituals where in some cases May Day rituals could be very transgressive, and people would have ritual sex, for instance. So from a Christian perspective, that was unacceptable. And if you have this kind of a May ritual where people have a wild party, they're dancing around fire, and there's strange ritual proclamations of couples who then run out to have ritual sex on ancient rock carvings and these kind of things, then and the pastor would then say, no, this is banned now, you can't do it. Then the next morning he finds a maypole standing outside his church door and these kind of things. And there has been this sort of tension down through the ages. So I mean, it's rather difficult for me to put a date on it like that. It is an important step when the power structure shifts onto Christianity. and that happens in the Middle Ages.
Hmm.
That the European feudal infrastructure of power, where kind of dynastic marriages and that whole sort of Game of Thrones reality that we that reality that we know from Game of Thrones, that kind of feudal system, when the greater part of the European context had switched onto Christianity, then the top social layers in Scandinavia kind of had to shift onto Christianity as well, because they were unable to create all these dynastic feudal alliances and marry their daughters off to Frankish princes and all that kind of thing. So the shift to Christianity was it didn't come as like a colonization in the same way as we know from history of colonization in, say, North America or something like that, where you have a foreign power that kind of lands on you and say, okay, so now you have to be Christian. But it did flow through power. So it was elites who converted to Christianity in order to be able to stay elites or be elites or play their elite games and create empires and all these things, that which was ideas that Scandinavians totally had in the Middle Ages. The some of the Danish kings in the Viking Age, they tried, sometimes successfully, to create huge empires. There was at one point in history where the entire North Sea region was actually gathered under Canute the Great for a short while. So that was their aspirations. You couldn't do that if you weren't Christian at the time. So yeah, so that was that shift, royals, kings becoming Christian. That was an important shift, but that didn't mean that people in the villages didn't continue doing a lot of other stuff.
Hmm. Hmm. One of the things that I guess I'm interested with you personally is how your engagement in the Afro-Brazilian traditions, did that have the effect of opening you up to something from your own ancestral traditions? Like to have that experience of it, you know, being involved in a living tradition, uh, was that a doorway into opening you up to exploring Nordic animism?
Yes, it was. There was um, experiences that came as a direct result of engaging some of that stuff. And again, it's important to note that these kinds of traditions that I became familiar with in Brazil, and whose knowledge keepers I was so lucky that they shared knowledge with me, that they are, at least in part, still very non-nationalist in their way of conceptualizing religion. Um, they have what actually, well, paradoxically, they have what they call nations. So they're different trains of tradition that comes from different places in Africa. Sometimes Spiritism would perhaps also be seen as a nation, and then that comes from Europe. But the thing about these nations is that uh, they're rather flexible. Like you can move a lot between them, and even deities or other than humans move quite a lot between them. So a lot of people perhaps start practicing Umbanda, and they will get some kind of contact with spirits of sorts. But then these spirits will sometimes tell them, you know what, I actually prefer that you continue your devotion to me in condomblé. And then the spirit will actually move the person into a different modality. Um, and even houses can, like a whole line, can sometimes change between different nations. So they will say, okay, so our line is Yoruba, or our line is Bantu, but now we practice Yoruba. Uh, well, actually, let's go back and practice Bantu again. Or a house can have different traditions inside it, and then have these different traditions almost as different um, reservoirs of tools that they use, and then that can so and I'm explaining this just to make clear that this idea of immersing in Yoruba tradition, for instance, and then that turns you in another direction, or for instance, it turns you in a North European direction from the perspective of condomblé, that's not weird at all. In fact, it's almost to be expected. So these traditions have that sort of very permissible aspect to them.
Hmm. So while you were in Brazil, did you actually, like while participating in a ritual, did you actually have an experience of a Northern European spirit or deity?
Not while I was in Brazil. Well, yeah, well, not in ritual, but I started having quite a lot of dreams,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and uh, and my dreams, and that was felt a bit weird because I was in Brazil and I was immersed in condomblé on all sides, but my dreams were overflowing with runes and ravens and you know ritual directions for how to engage Nordic other than human uh, beings and so on. So so Candomblé certainly, or that religious reality certainly did something to me that was part of opening that whole thing up.
Hmm. So, having an awakening in Brazil, when you get back home, how do you continue to cultivate that? What was opening up?
Well, there was a bit of a longer history behind that because um, I've been part of a ritual group in Denmark that had started practicing candomblé at some point, and a couple of guys had gotten initiated in Brazil. And that ritual group, this sort of, what you say, emergence of Nordic spirit or Nordic ashe in that basically it was not only me, it was to a large extent me, but it was also it was a thing that started happening there.
Hmm. Yeah, these things
Uh,
have a way of kind of rippling through different
yeah,
groups, hey? Yeah.
yeah. So so I've been part of that group, which is then uh like what it actually feels like is that it's a Nordic condomblé that's emerging there. Um, and that took its beginning with a guy who's a close friend of mine who actually initiated me in this. He was initiated in Brazil himself, but he started developing a ritual for engaging patron spirits, personal patron spirits, uh, what in the Nordic reality would be called a fylgja, kind of a patron, kind of like a guardian angel almost, or the Yoruba would call it an ori. And these so these rituals were he started basically connecting people to these guardian spirits, and that's basically where that sort of started. And these things kind of happened parallel with I got a PhD in Sweden and started studying candomblé and went to Brazil. Why that was so it was kind of melee of threads that sort of led in that direction. It wasn't like I went to Brazil and
Right. Wasn't so linear.
came back, and then it was a longer process where different people went to Brazil, and I also went to Brazil and came back and went to Brazil again, and so it was a longer.
Hmm. And when you start connecting to these patron spirits, are they exclusively Nordic spirits, or is it really open? Like you wait for what kind of spirit wants to show up for that person?
It's fairly open.
Yeah.
Like the part of the I think part of the point is to not be too idiosyncratic and sort of dogmatically systemic about the whole thing. Uh, so so like I think many, for instance, practitioners of Western esotericism, they have a tendency to make a lot of charts with a lot of correspondences and this or that zodiac sign corresponds with this or that and this. It's a very systemic way of thinking where we are trying to be much more practice based, so that it's more about just doing the things, and then as we go along we sort of let things evolve organically.
Hmm.
So and in that process, things have then shown to have this, you could say, naturalizing tendency where the Aché wants to become appropriate to place um, to Northern Europe.
Hmm. Hmm. Um, I think one of the things that's fascinating about the story is that here you go down to Brazil, and it sounds like you're quite welcome in the condomblé spaces. So is there no prejudice against outsiders or people of other races coming in and having this experience, or a fear that they're going to appropriate something and take it away? I mean,
Um,
what did you hear from the people there about that, if it
I
came up?
think North Americans expect that much more than possibly anybody else on the planet. Um, North America specifically has an intense um, culture of seclusion between different culture spaces, and that exchange between culture spaces are almost universally expected to be illegitimate or appropriative, and so on. And that's not to say that it isn't sometimes illegitimate and appropriative. It certainly sometimes is. I've heard stories about like councils of elders from indigenous groups that basically get together and make proclamations that basically make the point stay away from our tradition, because there has been basically locust swarms of hippies descending on the remains of their traditions in order to so sometimes it seems very legitimate that these criticisms are there, but in Brazil, the culture around also the culture around race is different, and that's not to say that it's exclusively only better than it is, for instance, in North America. There's significant racial problems in Brazil that are not being solved because of some of the differences between, for instance, North America and Brazil. There are significant problems in North America that are being solved because of the specific structure of this of a culture around race and culture in North America. But but when you approach uh, Afro-diasporic religion in Brazil, I don't know in Cuba, but in Brazil, then you're welcome, you know? And there isn't, yeah, some you can find people who will what do you call it, snicker a little bit of at you for, not being a black person. Yeah, you can find that, but like the house that I was mainly involved in Brazil was located in, I think, the blackest neighborhood in Salvador, which is the blackest city in the Americas. It's called like an African Rome. Women carry things on their heads in Salvador. It's an African city, and in that house, which was located in that blackest of blackest places, almost in the entire Americas, in that house there were several white people who were part of that cult, basically, and initiated in that cult. So the culture around these things is remarkably different, I think, from what I think many Americans would expect.
Hmm. Yeah, I was thinking about that recently, like why I seem to have more sensitivity to the impact of colonialism than some people that I know in Europe. Like I have a men's reading group going on right now, and we're looking at a old German folk tale. And I was talking about how to read a story in an anti-colonialist perspective. Um, and it didn't seem to resonate so well with my friends in Northern Europe. And so I was thinking about that. And, what I'm getting at is maybe that because of this particular place, Canada and America, the effects of colonialism are right in your face if you're willing to look. And a lot of people don't turn to face it. But like we have a native reservation just a mile down the road from us. And so I thought maybe that was why I was a little more sensitive to ideas of appropriation and colonization than maybe my European brothers.
And it might very much be the case. I think that many, like I said, I think many Americans they feel like they're far ahead of Europeans in the realization of these things. There, sometimes you have a feeling that every single American that you interact with have an MA in critical race studies, um, and but this also has the effect of producing a kind of culture that I can't help perceiving it as strongly nationalist, like
Yeah.
that, for instance.
Segregationist. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
one of the things I think it leads to, ironically, is kind of a very unconscious effect of colo colonialism, like the idea that we're separate, this is for us, that's yours. But because when you look at other places in the world, like we've been talking about, there's so much interchange, and those geographic boundaries or even racial boundaries aren't as important as where the spirit is moving,
Hmm. Yeah,
right? Yeah,
yeah, yeah, totally. No, I totally think you're right. The like there's a racist structure called white exceptionalism. The idea that white people are supposed to be separate from everybody else and perhaps elevated in some
perhaps. Yeah, I think
way,
that's
right?
that's it. Is
Uh,
that we're the best,
and
we're the most evolved. Mhm.
exactly. Uh, but and today, of course, valorizations are shifting, and it's very healthy and positive that we are today devalorizing whiteness. We should do it more, uh, uh, because the valorization of whiteness has been a monstrously destructive thing.
Yeah,
Um, uh, but it's important that in this change in valorizing, that we don't maintain the structure of exceptionalism. And that's what I sometimes feel, exactly like you say, that the separation is being actually reinvented in new languages. And I'm very anxious about what that can do to people. Uh, there are a lot of white people in the world. I'm not sure you want to encase them in whiteness. I think we should I think we should try to get them out of
dissolve the
whiteness,
whiteness. Yeah.
dissolve whiteness. Yeah. So
Mhm. Yeah.
It's not wise to, for instance, encase Eurodescendant people in whiteness. It's I don't think it's possible that isolating Eurodescendants in whiteness will do positive things for the world.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's one of the reasons why I don't use the term white to describe myself. I don't think it does justice to the kind of mongrel nature of my ancestry, first of all. And I think it's a false category. And yeah, obviously one that's been used to oppress people. And
Mm,
so I think, my little project is like, let's dissolve that terminology and get more
yeah,
specific, and if it takes me a few minutes to explain where my people are from, well, so be it.
yeah,
Uh, yeah. But I think
yeah,
like these kind of religious traditions, the fact that they are so open and so adaptable, there's something to them that seems to me like that's like the liberation theology of the future in a way. If we're going to um get along better in the world and with the world at large.
yeah. Amen, brother. Yeah, I think I think you're right. Like, I think some of these ways of thinking and practicing developed by um, Afro-Descendant peoples, I think in the path that everybody has, or that so many people are thinking about towards a decolonial future, I think it has an incredible potential. And what you're actually already seeing today is, for instance, indigenous peoples applying these ways of thinking. So you see in Brazil, there's a group called the Pataxó who have been subjected to an extremely violent colonial process, and they have been very ruptured. And they are using Afro-Brazilian condomblé in order to recover and reinvent their own ancestrality, indigenous Brazilians. So, so I think that when we on this path to a decolonial future, I think stuff like Santeria, voodoo, I think it has an incredible potential to uh, pose um, nodes of resilience towards modernity, to create counter-modern spaces of animist, functional animist technology for
Mm.
for all peoples.
I don't know why, but I get really excited when I hear that or think about that possibility. It excites me. Like I feel
Mm,
the ashe in my body rising. Like,
mm,
what's interesting about that is it's somewhat paradoxical in a way, or it might seem paradoxical to some people, especially the kind of white academic segregationalists. Um, I was with a teacher years ago called Stephen Jenkinson here in Canada. He's done a lot of writing about death and dying and things. Um, and over the course of the week that I was with him, he was speaking quite a bit about Euro-descended people going to other cultures and taking up things like yoga or going to the jungle and drinking ayahuasca. And he had a kind of a denigrating tone when he would talk about these things. And so after one of the sessions, I went up and spoke with him. I said, look, I've been really sincerely engaged in some of these practices, like especially yoga and working with ayahuasca through this Santo Daime cult. I said, it's really helped me in my life. It's been really beneficial, So when I hear you denigrate them, I wonder, like, what do you expect from us if we don't have a living tradition here in North America as Euro-descended people, other than Christianity and Protestant Christianity, which it was never appealing to me. What do you expect us to do with all of that? And he said something that really stuck with me. He said, "Well, what if consider the possibility that actually your ancestors put you on those paths of yoga or plant medicine or shamanism in order for you to find your way back to them." And when I hear you talk about going to Brazil and being engaged in candomblé and having this awakening to these Nordic spirits and Ancestry, there is that kind of strange trickster quality to it.
Mm,
Like, you go to the exotic and you end up finding yourself right back at home, but with a different perspective, one that we might call animist. And I mean, that was very much my experience, and that allowed me actually to connect to this land more and to engage with native people without being so hungry to take on their rites and rituals, but
mm,
to appreciate what they were doing and maybe learn about possible ways to put it into practice, the
mm.
engagement with the aliveness of the world and all of its uh, diversity, right? And you produced a short film called Finnfaring that
Mm.
tells a story like this about this Sami guy. So an indigenous Finlander, I guess, right? Is the Sami people? They're from around
Uh,
Finland, or
no, he's actually from the border between Norway and Sweden. And Sápmi, the Sami areas, are actually in both Russia, Finland, Norway, and Sweden. Um,
okay, but he's you would consider them indigenous people, the Sami?
certainly, certainly, they're an
Okay.
indigenous population. Yeah,
Can you tell the story
yeah.
of
This
him?
is yeah the yeah. This is an amazing story. When I heard about Jungle Swanee is his name, uh, I thought, man, that would be interesting to hear that because he he grew up as a non-nationalized reindeer herder, traditional indigenous Sami in like a no-road country in the far north of Scandinavia, a place called Katawarma. And as he explained it to me, he at an early point in his life felt this calling towards shamanism, the lost shamanism of his own people. The Sami used to have religious experts, what would be called shamans, called nuaidit. Sometimes the craft is called nuaidi water, and they have, that was there, and it was then discontinued as a consequence of colonialism. They were persecuted rather violently, their shamans. So Jungle, he basically decided, or he lived for a long time alone in the wilderness, and then at some point he reached the point where he felt he needed an actual teacher. So he managed to raise money to go to South America, and then he was at Ecuador. I think he went into the jungle, found a teacher, and stayed there for 5 or 6 years in a one-to-one apprenticeship relation with the teacher there. And after that, he went back to Sapmi as well, and a fully educated shaman. And I found that story amazing because it, in a sense, it mirrors what I've done myself. Um, the uh, the uh, the Nordic peoples actually had a word for that, which was Finnfaring, faring to the Finns, and the word Finns was an old word for the Sami. Today, the word Finns means people from
Ah,
Finland, which is a slightly different people. So, so you can see in the old Christian laws from the Middle Ages that they say they prohibit a practice which is visiting the Finns or going to the Finns to seek prophetic knowledge or animist knowledge, basically, which means that you can see
right.
that people probably did exactly that. They went to the Sami to learn from Sami people. So
Hmm.
this is a traditional knowledge uh, uh, context where the practice of a traditional animism is seen as inherently based on engagement with others. The Sami in the Nordic context was an other, and in the pre-Christian context, that was considered a positive thing. It was they were considered powerful. There would probably also have been conflicts with them and so on, but they were considered important and they were considered powerful. And early Norwegian kings, um, when they wrote their sagas, they took good care to emphasize that they had Sami ancestry So a way of saying I am a legitimate, powerful Viking king was to say, yeah, and my ancestors were Sami reindeer herders. Uh, the connectivity to other is important. So I have thought of my own going to South America to learn from these perspectives as a Finnfarer, a, a, a way of visiting the other. And I think this visiting the other is like today is probably a universal thing. There's so many people who seek other in order to at some point perhaps be turned towards their own root culture in one way or the other. And in this very globalized world, these uh, this engagement with other can be perhaps surprising and enriching in surprising ways. Like I'm 100% ethnically unambiguous old worlder from Scandinavia, but my path, you could say, towards realizing this engagement with my own tradition is, you could say it's 100% American because it comes from, because I've learned to think about these things by condomblé priestesses. The methodology that underlies how I think is predicated on these uh, Creole patterns of cultural resilience that has emerged in the Americas, right? I think there's a I think there's a beauty to that somehow, and I think that when you perhaps is also why I think, as I think I said before, I think some of the responses to our time are probably going to come from the Americas, exactly as you say, because you live like down the road from a colonial situation, a colonial reality that for your peers in a study group can be a little bit difficult to understand because they're not close to it in that way. And when you talk about your own ancestry as mongrel or very mixed, I think that that is like, I think the responses that we need in the future, they will take that and make that a source of pride. That
Right.
is,
About value that.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
exactly. And which
Yeah.
you sometimes see in you see it in Brazil and Mexico, for instance. You see that they build their self-image in a positive way on their mixedness. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's incredible that at the same time that there is a lot of this drawing of really hard lines that thou shalt not cross, thou shalt not intermix. That's happening really intensely in my country right now. Right now, there are protests going on all over the country about, well, a movement to include more kind of gender studies in primary school from kindergarten up. And there's people who, I mean, it's a whole thing. But just to say that's indicative of the kind of divisions that are really strong right now. Um, and at the same time, there's something else kind of bubbling away. This Creole mix. Um, I mean, I just find it really kind of amazing, and it gives me a hope for the future that, you know, when I talk to somebody like Bio and I talk to you, uh, it gives me hope, you know,
Mm.
that there is a future that we can't even imagine because it's going to be so kind of mixed up and strange that we can't even conceive of it from this
Mm.
vantage point.
And
Yeah.
perhaps it's going to be place focused. Like perhaps in Bios Yoruba tradition, they would call it an ile, a place, or an ile ashe, they would say in Brazil, a place where a certain ashe is is flowing, and that is where a group of people derive their self-image. Like, in a sense, that is very strongly animist, that being bound to place. So an example is I launched I didn't launch, I developed this Nordic Animism platform, and have been developing this thought and this thinking about Nordic Animism as a way of thinking about Euro traditional knowledge, right? And then at some point I saw at Facebook that there was this guy who had he even made like a little logo, and he called it Appalachian Animism. And I think he might have been inspired by me. I hope he was. I would be so proud of you. I think he was probably inspired by me. And to me, that was perfect. It was perfect. Like that thing that there are some people there who are like inspired, and they take the ball, they run with it, and then what they're doing is that they're thinking about their place. This was Appalachian animism. It wasn't, I don't know, white people's
Nordic,
animism.
it wasn't Nordic animism, yeah, kind of
Yeah, yeah,
transported into Appalachia.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, that's the thing about animism, is it is going to, I mean, if it's not just a kind of thought experiment or even a belief
yeah,
system, it it connects you to place. It just
yeah,
is. And one of the things I've been thinking about is like how the entire world, I think, would be better off if there was more animists. It's good for people and the planet.
mm, yeah,
But it's not something that you can only believe or take on as a belief. It has to it's a fundamental shift in consciousness, I think.
yeah.
And so I've been thinking about, well, how do we convert more people to animism? Like, what
Well,
does it take? Does it take really profound spiritual experiences through plant medicine or mushrooms, or something like a condomblé ritual, which has a psychedelic effect with all the music and the scents
mm,
and the movement? Does it take a direct kind of Gnostic experience, and then animism is the natural byproduct of that opening? I don't know. Have you thought about that at all?
yeah. And I've also gotten that question a lot, and I think that it's possible that all the things that you mentioned there are possibly really good suggestions, or perhaps they will be components. What I would suggest to start with is to deplace belief completely. Like your yoga teacher, man. Like, just say, this is just what's there. This is what my teacher gave me. Because when you are talking about, for instance, psychedelic experiences, or I don't know if I'm reading into what you're saying now, but I can't help thinking that perhaps you're searching for an experience of connectivity, for instance, with other than humans, that would then make it legitimate for you, or something like that. But or for, maybe it wasn't for you. You probably know
I'm
all
I'm
kinds of
already
elves and angels and demons and stuff.
I was gonna say
But
I'm already there, brother. But
yeah,
like,
yeah,
how do
yeah,
we
yeah,
how
yeah.
how do we how do
But
we missionize
but
animism
the,
in a way?
but then for then for the other people, um, I think I think the basic recommendation would be to start doing it. If we start giving to a tree and asking the tree for help, we will start revealing the world to ourselves as the spirit in the tree also helping us, because we are immersing ourselves in engagement with that subject on a fundamental, like deep psychological and epistemological, perceptive level. I don't think we can avoid uh, perceiving a someone there if we have entered into a reciprocal relationship with that someone. When we start giving and receiving back, then the someone is there already. It is there in that giving and receiving. So I would say, forget about belief. Let's encourage people to start giving. And I sometimes say this when, like, when I'm asked, like, if you have an elf that lives in a stone in, say, Iceland or anywhere else, and you ask the elf, what would you like the best? That I harbor a abstract theoretical belief in your ontological validity that you exist, or a bowl of porridge? What would you like the best of these two things? I'm absolutely sure that the elf would say, I would like the bowl of porridge. It's not that the ontological validity of his existence is absolutely relevant to him. I mean, it is a little bit impolite if I walk up to you and say, "Hey, brother, I don't believe you exist." That's not particularly nice to you. So, but if you're hungry, and I gave you the choice between a bowl of porridge and my belief in your existence, you'd probably choose the bowl of porridge. And I think that there is that thing in the world that we need to start giving that bowl of porridge, because that is actually the most important thing from the animist perspective, more than thinking about and talking about the belief in, which of course is what I'm doing all the time. I'm going blah blah blah, like all my waking hours on YouTube and podcasts and whatnot. But yeah, but I'm also trying. I'm trying to reach into practice. Like, I wrote a book about calendar rituals, and uh, have published a wall calendar of these traditional knowledge things and so on, which is, it's a way of trying to draw lines from these very wordy thinking spaces, thinking talking spaces, and into practical doing spaces.
Hmm. Yeah, I think, beside the kind of the kind of big revelatory experience that can convert a materialist into an animist, I do believe that there are some things that you can just do and it will change your perception over time. Like something like yoga. If you practice yoga in a sincere way, there's no way, you don't have to take on the belief that that the breath is a life force or contains a life force. Uh, it becomes apparent, and you go, oh, I get it. Ah, prana, no longer a concept,
Hmm.
living
Yeah,
reality,
yeah,
and that it can move, and all of that. So I do believe that, like, yeah, there's something to that. If you have to fake it for a while because it's an aspiration of yours, go for it. Give that
hmm,
bowl of porridge, even if you're not quite sure if there's an elf there or
yeah,
not. Yeah.
yeah,
And I think that's reflected in that article that I mentioned before on taking animism seriously. There was also that being able to hold the kind of, maybe not taking on the ontological, like being so sure that the bear is a grandfather spirit, but acting as if, in a
yeah.
way, like being able to hold both is also, to me, very animistic and playful, and allows for uncertainty, um, that doesn't negate the value of the act or the gesture.
Hmm.
Does that make sense? Like, I
It
can be
probably does, but could you
non-dogmatic about it.
tell me again? It's a little bit late over here. That it
Yeah.
allows.
Well, that it allows for a kind of ontological uncertainty while still valuing the act or the gesture,
Yeah, yeah,
the acting as if, like there
yeah,
is that, like it allows for
yeah. There's something
ontological
about,
uncertainty. Yeah.
yeah. There's something about that, as if, yeah. And I think, but I think that if you are sufficiently immersed in practice, I think uncertainty will just disappear completely. It's not even like, if you, and these condomblé spaces, for instance, there isn't like, at least as I perceive them, there's not any great uncertainty there. I seen a man sitting like this. He was talking about some religious duties that he couldn't really be bothered to do. So he was saying that he was saying, "Oh, I can't really be bothered with that religious seclusion." So in that moment, when he said that, his orisha was angry, and it came and possessed him in that moment to kind of be a little bit like give him a little one and say, what are you saying? And I've seen because these people have built so strong uh, counterpoints to modernity in their spaces. I think they that that reality is just built in a different way in those spaces. I remember reading, by the way, the American author Maya Deren, who is she's describing her immersement
Oh, yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
in voodoo, and she has that experience. She's dancing, and at some point during the dancing, she realizes that there isn't a distinction between the dancing as a performance and the dancing as an actual invocation of that deity. It
Mm-hmm.
is just an invocation of the deity. And when she has that realization as a white darkness is reaching up through her legs and engulfing her, and she falls into a white darkness and hears a choir of angels singing the name of the goddess that is possessing her in that moment. uh, I think in the doing, I think there is like there might be a space for ontological uncertainty in doing as well, uh, but I think the important thing is to basically displace the question and just
Yeah.
do, and
Yeah.
then that doing will shape reality by itself.
Yeah. That's great. Well, this has been really fun talking with you. Rune, try it again. Rune, I do my
Yeah,
best.
that's great, man. Yeah.
And I'll put the links to your work down below. There's a lot to explore on your YouTube. Um, any place where you would recommend people begin? Because you do have a lot of content there.
Uh,
You have like a video, I think, called What is Nordic Animism? Like, or just scroll through and see what grabs your attention.
yeah, I would recommend checking out my playlists because I've tried to organize my videos into playlists, and there will be uh, topics there that might grab your attention, like sacred fire or the Ragnarok or uh, sacred beer, different aspects of Nordic animism that you ancestry, these kind of things. So I would recommend just going to my YouTube channel, check the playlists, and see what you find interesting.
Well, I didn't know you had one on sacred beer, and so I'm intrigued. So I'm gonna put that one on the watch list.
Cool, cool.
All right. Thanks a lot, my friend. Take care.
Thanks for having me on. You too, man.